For 5 years, she was the invisible heartbeat of the surgical ward, a soft-spoken nurse who never made mistakes, never panicked, and never talked about her past. But her carefully constructed life shattered the day a retired military K-9 walked into the hospital, stopped dead in its tracks, and gave her a full combat salute. To the administrative staff at Providence General Hospital in Portland, Oregon, Madeline Hayes was the perfect employee. She never complained about picking up the grueling night shifts, she never engaged in the petty break room gossip, and she possessed an almost supernatural ability to remain calm when the emergency room doors burst open with fresh chaos. For 5 years, Madeline existed as a ghost in pale blue scrubs. She was a woman of average height with unremarkable brown hair, usually pulled back into a tight utilitarian bun. Her colleagues knew absolutely nothing about her life outside the sliding glass doors of the hospital. She drove a faded 10-year-old Volvo sedan, paid for her cafeteria coffee in exact cash, and listed a corporate P.O. box as her home address on all HR forms. If anyone asked about her weekend, she offered a polite, deflective smile and seamlessly turned the conversation back to patient charts. Dr. Harrison Wright, the head of trauma surgery, often remarked that Madeline had ice water in her veins. He had seen her handle a massive arterial bleed from a multi-car pileup without her pulse rising a single beat. While junior nurses screamed for crash carts and dropped sterilized instruments in panic, Madeline moved with a chilling, mechanical efficiency. Her hands never shook. Her voice never rose above a measured, authoritative murmur. "You act like you've done this in a war zone, Maddie," charge nurse Evelyn Foster had joked one rainy Tuesday, watching Madeline effortlessly pack a complex puncture wound that had left a surgical resident looking green. Madeline had simply kept her eyes on the gauze. "I just like to stay focused, Evelyn, that's all." But beneath her serene exterior, Madeline's reality was a perpetual state of hypervigilance. She didn't just walk into a room. She scanned it for secondary exits, structural vulnerabilities, and improvised weapons. When a helicopter flew low over the hospital helipad, a microscopic flinch rippled through her shoulders, a muscle memory she couldn't completely erase. She was a woman running from a ghost, hiding in plain sight by wrapping herself in the mundane routine of civilian medicine. Her meticulously constructed sanctuary began to crack in the late autumn of 2025. A severe electrical fire at the nearby Veterans Affairs Medical Center forced an immediate emergency evacuation of their critical care and surgical recovery wards. Providence General, being the closest Level 1 trauma center, absorbed the overflow. Within hours, the usually quiet corridors of the fourth floor were flooded with military veterans, harried VA transfer coordinators, and a sudden, dense atmosphere of unresolved trauma. Among the new arrivals was Sergeant Jason Carmichael. Jason was a decorated Army Ranger, recovering from extensive reconstructive surgery on his shattered right femur, the parting gift of an improvised explosive device outside of Kandahar. But Jason hadn't come to Providence General alone. Tethered to his side was a massive, heavily scarred Belgian Malinois named Coda. Coda was not a fluffy, golden-haired therapy dog trained to rest his chin on hospital beds and accept pets from strangers. Coda was a retired tactical explosive detection dog, Ted. He was a veteran of 3 combat deployments, bearing a jagged scar across his left flank and a demeanor that radiated pure, coiled energy. He walked with military precision, his golden eyes scanning the nurse's station with the same intense scrutiny he once used to scan dusty desert roads for tripwires. The hospital administration had granted a rare exception for Coda to remain in the room with Jason, given the dog's specialized status and Jason's severe PTSD. The staff was strictly instructed not to pet, feed, or make sudden movements toward the animal. When Madeline's shift began at 7 p.m., Evelyn handed her the transfer charts with a heavy sigh. "You've got room 412, the Ranger and his attack dog. I sent a junior nurse in there an hour ago to check his vitals, and the dog growled so low it shook the glass." "Be careful, Madeline." "It's just a dog, Evelyn," Madeline replied softly, taking the clipboard. "They're trained to read energy. If you walk in terrified, they treat you like a threat. Just don't get your hand bitten off. We're short-staffed as it is." Madeline approached room 412. She paused outside the door, taking a deep, slow breath to regulate her heart rate. She pushed the door open, her rubber-soled shoes making no sound against the linoleum. Jason was awake, staring at the muted television. Curled at the foot of his bed was Coda. The moment Madeline crossed the threshold, the atmosphere in the room violently shifted. Coda's head snapped up, his ears pinned back, not in aggression, but in sudden, intense recognition. The dog scrambled off the bed, his claws clicking sharply against the floor. Jason immediately tensed, reaching for the leash draped over the bedrail. Coda, Heim, Jason commanded, using the German recall word. But for the first time in his life, Coda ignored his handler. The massive Malinois stalked toward Madeline. He didn't bare his teeth, he didn't growl. Instead, he stopped exactly 3 feet in front of her, sat back on his haunches, thrust his chest out, and raised his right paw slightly off the ground, a highly classified, specific alert posture, taught only to Elite K, 9 units, to silently signal the presence of a ranking handler or a recognized friendly operative in a hostile environment. Coda stared up at Madeline, his tail wagging in a stiff, rhythmic thud against the floor. He let out a soft, almost imperceptible whine. Madeline froze, her heart slammed against her ribs. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. Without thinking, her hand twitched, moving into a quick, sharp, tactical hand signal, a closed fist, followed by 2 fingers pointing down. Stand down, at ease. Instantly, Coda dropped from his rigid alert posture, his body relaxing. He stepped forward and gently pressed his large, wet nose against Madeline's scrub pocket, huffing quietly. From the hospital bed, Jason's eyes widened, his gaze darting from the dog to the quiet, unassuming night nurse. The silence in the room stretched, thick and suffocating. He's never done that, Jason said, his voice low and dangerous. He only alerts like that for JSOC handlers, and he certainly doesn't take hand signals from civilian nurses. Madeline recovered instantly, plastering her polite, detached smile back onto her face. He's a beautiful dog, Sergeant Carmichael. I think he just smells the beef stew I had for dinner in the cafeteria. She stepped forward, deliberately ignoring the dog, and began checking Jason's IV drip. Jason grabbed her wrist. His grip was like iron. I didn't use an English command. I spoke to him in German, and you just gave him a classified SOCOM release signal. Who the hell are you? I'm Madeline, your registered nurse, she said, her voice remaining perfectly steady, though her eyes locked onto his with a cold, terrifying intensity that made the combat veteran involuntarily loosen his grip, and your blood pressure is elevated. I suggest you get some rest. She left the room quickly, but as the door swung shut, she knew the truth. The countdown had started. 5 years of perfect hiding had just been undone by the nose of a loyal soldier. By midnight, the hospital had settled into the quiet, rhythmic hum typical of the graveyard shift. But for Madeline, the silence was deafening. Every squeak of a shoe, every ping of an elevator bell felt like an incoming threat. She retreated to the sterile supply closet to conduct inventory, a task she usually found meditative. Tonight, her hands moved mechanically over boxes of saline and gauze while her mind raced through contingencies. She had a bug-out bag hidden in the false bottom of her locker. It contained a forged Canadian passport, $60,000 in vacuum-sealed $100 bills, and a dismantled Sig Sauer P-365. She could be out of the hospital in 3 minutes, on the interstate in 10, and across the border by dawn. But running meant exposing herself. It meant starting over. And she was so unimaginably tired of running. He's just one soldier, she told herself, gripping a box of syringes until the cardboard crumpled. He's confined to a bed. He can't prove anything. But Jason Carmichael was not a man who let mysteries go. The Army had trained him to analyze anomalies, and Nurse Madeline Hayes was a glaring, flashing anomaly. When Madeline returned to the floor, she noticed a subtle shift in Jason's behavior. He was awake every time she passed his room. He watched her through the glass with the calculating eyes of a sniper. He was studying her movements, the way she walked with her weight slightly forward on the balls of her feet, the way her eyes continuously scanned the corridor, the way she instinctively kept her dominant hand free at all times. Around 2 a.m., the situation escalated. A code blue rang out, but it wasn't a standard medical emergency. A patient in the ER, a suspected gang member, brought in earlier with minor lacerations, suddenly pulled a concealed knife and slashed a security guard's throat before bolting toward the stairwell. The hospital's automated lockdown system triggered. Heavy fire doors slammed shut, sealing off the 4th floor corridor. The PA system crackled. Code Silver, security threat on premises. All staff secure in place. Panic erupted at the nurse's station. Evelyn dropped her clipboard, her hands flying to her mouth. Oh my God, he's in the building. He's coming up the stairs. While the rest of the staff huddled behind the flimsy wooden desk, paralyzed by fear, a switch flipped deep inside Madeline's brain. The quiet, compliant nurse vanished. The operative took over. She didn't hide. She moved. Evelyn, get everyone into the medication room. It has a steel core door and keycard access. Go. Now, Madeline ordered. Her voice was no longer soft. It was a guttural, commanding bark that left no room for hesitation. What about you? Evelyn stammered, terrified by the sudden transformation in her meek colleague. I'm securing the ward. Madeline moved down the corridor with terrifying fluidity. She didn't have a weapon, so she improvised. She grabbed a heavy, solid metal fire extinguisher from the wall mount, holding it not by the handle, but by the base, balancing it like a blunt force striking tool. From room 412, Jason dragged himself out of bed, leaning heavily on his crutches. Coda was by his side, the dog's hackles raised, emitting a low, rumbling growl. Jason watched through his open doorway as Madeline took a tactical position beside the heavy fire doors leading to the stairwell. She wasn't cowering. She was waiting in an ambush position, utilizing the fatal funnel of the doorway. She's hunting, Jason realized, his blood running cold. That's a Tier 1 combat stance. The heavy metal door of the stairwell rattled. Someone was yanking on the handle from the other side. The lockdown magnetic locks held for a moment, but a loud crack echoed as the frantic assailant shot the locking mechanism with a smuggled handgun he had wrestled from the wounded guard. The door violently swung open. The man lunged through, wild-eyed, covered in blood, raising the gun. He never even saw Madeline. As he crossed the threshold, she pivoted. With devastating speed and calculated brutality, she swung the heavy fire extinguisher. She didn't aim for his head. She aimed for the radial nerve in his gun arm. The metal cylinder connected with a sickening crack. The man screamed, dropping the weapon as his arm went entirely numb. Before he could recover, Madeline stepped inside his guard. She swept his legs out from under him with a brutal kick to the back of his knee, sending him crashing to the linoleum. Instantly, she dropped her knee directly onto his throat, pinning him to the floor. She grabbed the fallen handgun, effortlessly cleared the chamber, dropped the magazine, and slid the disabled weapon down the hallway all in less than 3 seconds. She reached into her scrub pocket, pulled out a pair of heavy-duty medical trauma shears, and pressed the blunt tip directly against the man's carotid artery. "Breathe, and I open your neck," she whispered. Her tone was completely flat, devoid of adrenaline, devoid of fear. The man froze, his eyes bulging in absolute terror. Down the hallway, Jason stood frozen on his crutches. Coda wasn't barking. The K9 was sitting perfectly still, watching Madeline with absolute, unwavering respect. Security guards finally burst through the opposite end of the corridor, weapons drawn, shouting commands. When they saw the petite night nurse effortlessly pinning a violent armed suspect to the floor, they stopped in their tracks, utterly bewildered. Madeline slowly stood up, smoothing down her pale blue scrubs. She handed the attacker over to the guards, picked up her fallen clipboard, and turned back to the nurse's station as if she had just finished taking a patient's temperature. But as she walked past room 412, she saw Jason standing in the doorway. He wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at the floor. During the brief, violent scuffle, the hidden pocket on the inside of Madeline's scrub top had torn. A small, black, heavy object had fallen out and skittered across the waxed linoleum, coming to rest right at Coda's paws. It was a challenge coin, but not a standard military token. It was matte black, bearing no words, only the deeply engraved insignia of the Directorate of Operations, the most classified, deniable covert action arm of the Central Intelligence Agency, a unit colloquially known as the Ground Branch, composed of former Delta Force and SEALs who officially did not exist. Coda sniffed the coin. He remembered the metallic scent of the people who carried them. The dog picked the heavy coin up gently in his teeth, walked over to Madeline, and sat, offering it up to her like a retrieved prize. Madeline stared at the coin in the dog's mouth. The hospital corridor around her seemed to fade away. The hum of the fluorescent lights vanished, replaced by the phantom roar of a Black Hawk helicopter and the smell of burning sand. She reached out with a trembling hand and took the coin from Coda. Jason shifted his weight on his crutches. He looked at the disabled attacker being hauled away, then at the black coin in Madeline's hand. "A civilian nurse doesn't disarm a shooter with a modified Krav Maga takedown," Jason said, his voice echoing in the sudden quiet of the hallway. He stepped closer, his eyes locked onto hers. "And a civilian nurse doesn't carry a ghost coin. I know what that insignia means. I lost men pulling one of your operatives out of a burning compound in Syria. Madeline closed her fist around the cold metal. The charade was over. You don't know anything, Sergeant, she whispered, her eyes flashing with a dangerous cornered light. I know, Jason replied softly, that whoever you are hiding from, they just found you. He nodded toward the stairwell door. Embedded in the wood, right where the attacker had been standing, wasn't just a stray bullet hole. Pinned to the doorframe by a tactical throwing knife was a small, scorched piece of fabric. It was a torn piece of Madeline's old military uniform. The past hadn't just caught up to her, it had cornered her. Madeline ripped the throwing knife from the doorframe with a sharp, practiced twist. The scorched fabric wasn't just any piece of uniform, it bore the faded blood type patch from her last highly classified mission in Bogota. The man she had just violently subdued wasn't a random gang member. He was a scout, a canary sent into the coal mine to see if the ghost would bite. And she had bitten hard. We have exactly 4 minutes before the real team breaches this floor, Madeline stated, her voice entirely devoid of panic, slipping seamlessly into the cold, clinical cadence of a tactical commander. She turned and tossed the stolen handgun to Jason. He caught it instinctively with his left hand, leaning heavily on his aluminum crutches, his military training instantly overriding his physical pain. I can't run, nurse, Jason muttered, checking the magazine of the weapon with a smooth, practiced efficiency. But I can hold a fatal funnel. Go. Nobody is holding anything. You're coming with me, she ordered, striding rapidly toward the heavy metal medical cart. She began stripping it of essential supplies, epinephrine, combat tourniquets, hemostatic gauze, stuffing them into her deep scrub pockets. They aren't here to arrest me, Sergeant. They are a Black Ops retrieval squad from a private military corporation known as Academy. They are instructed to sweep the board. They will kill you, Evelyn, and every single patient on this floor, just to ensure no witnesses ever see my face. Jason looked down at Coda. The massive dog let out a low, rumbling growl, the fur along his spine standing on end as he sensed the imminent violence approaching. Why are highly trained mercenaries hunting a dead woman? Because the dead woman knows exactly where the agency buried $300 million in untraceable bearer bonds, Madeline replied, gripping a heavy green oxygen tank and ripping it fiercely from its wall mount. Now move. Freight elevator. Right now. Jason didn't argue. He knew the chilling look in her eyes all too well. It was the 1,000-yard stare of an apex predator that had just been backed into a corner. He hobbled toward the service doors as fast as his shattered femur would allow, Coda sticking to his left thigh like glue. They slipped into the sterile utility corridor, just as the main stairwell doors at the end of the hall blew open. The terrifying, unmistakable sound of suppressed submachine gun fire hissed through the air, shattering the reinforced glass of the nurse's station into a million glittering pieces. Men dressed entirely in matte black tactical gear flooded the ward, moving with lethal, terrifying synchronization. Madeline dragged Jason into the oversized hospital freight elevator, slamming her fist onto the basement button. The heavy steel doors groaned shut, just as a burst of 9mm rounds sparked violently against the closing gap. The basement gives us access to the subterranean steam tunnels, Madeline explained, her eyes fixed coldly on the descending red floor indicator. It leads out to the city's municipal drainage network. You've scouted the exfiltration routes of a civilian hospital? Jason asked, raising a skeptical eyebrow despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. I scout the exfiltration routes of the grocery store, Sergeant. Suddenly, the elevator jerked to a violent, stomach-dropping halt halfway between the first floor and the basement. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered and died, plunging them into absolute, suffocating darkness. A second later, the emergency backup lights kicked on, bathing the small steel box in a sickly, pulsating crimson glow. They cut the main power grid, Jason whispered, gripping his weapon tighter. They're overriding the elevator shafts from the control room. Directly above them, the distinct, heavy sound of combat boots landing on the elevator car roof echoed like a thunderclap. Steel cables groaned under the added weight. Dust and debris showered down through the rusted ventilation grate. Stand back against the wall, Madeline whispered urgently. She climbed atop the metal hand railing, pulling the small, pressurized oxygen tank from her pocket. She wedged it tightly, directly under the locking mechanism of the roof hatch. Wrapping a strip of medical tape around a chemical thermal pad from her trauma kit, she fashioned a crude but highly effective delayed thermal charge. Cover your ears and open your mouth, she hissed, dropping gracefully back down to the floor. Jason pulled Coda close, burying his face in the dog's thick neck to protect the animal's sensitive ears. The thermal pad melted rapidly through the metal valve. The highly pressurized oxygen violently expanded within the confined space of the steel lock. The resulting explosion wasn't fiery, but the concussive force was absolutely massive. The heavy steel hatch blew entirely off its hinges, rocketing upward and smashing brutally into the operative waiting on the roof. A heavy thud and a muffled scream told them the roof was temporarily clear. Madeline leaped upward, grabbing the ledge, and pulled herself through the smoking opening with sheer Olympic agility. She reached down, grabbing Jason firmly by his tactical vest, and with a massive surge of adrenaline, hauled the wounded ranger up onto the roof of the car. Coda followed instantly, scrambling up Jason's back with pure canine athleticism. Up the maintenance ladder, Madeline pointed into the pitch-black, greasy shaft, 2 floors up to the parking garage access. The subterranean hospital parking garage was a damp, echoing maze of concrete pillars and flickering, dying fluorescent tubes. The cold Oregon rain lashed relentlessly against the grated exhaust vents, masking the sound of their ragged, desperate breathing. Jason was losing steam rapidly, his surgically repaired leg throbbing with agonizing, blinding intensity. Coda walked point, his nose twitching frantically, sweeping the dark concrete expanse for incoming threats. "My car is parked on level 3, Madeline said softly, supporting a significant portion of Jason's weight over her shoulder. Suddenly, Coda froze completely. He didn't bark. He dropped instantly into a silent, belly-low combat crawl, staring intensely at a cluster of shadowed transport vans parked near the exit ramp. "Ambush," Jason breathed, raising his handgun with a trembling arm. From the deep shadows, 5 men materialized. They were heavily armed, wearing multi-lens night vision optics and carrying suppressed Heckler and Koch MP5 submachine guns. At their center stood a man in a pristine, tailored charcoal suit, looking entirely out of place in the damp, grimy concrete bunker. "Hello, Maddie," the man echoed, his voice slick, arrogant, and hollow. "5 long years. I must admit, I truly thought you were decaying in a shallow, unmarked grave in Caracas. Imagine my total surprise when a facial recognition algorithm pinged a ghost working the night shift at a hospital in Portland." Madeline stepped smoothly in front of Jason, her posture radiating lethal, terrifying calm. "Director, Sterling Hayes. I see you're still doing the agency's dirty work off the official books. And you are still a stubborn, irritating liability?" Hayes smiled thinly. "You stole the bonds, Maddie. You betrayed the directorate." "I stole the bonds because you were using them to secretly fund black site torture programs for the cartel," Madeline shot back, her voice echoing sharply off the cold concrete. "I secured them. And if I die here tonight, the decryption keys automatically upload to the secure servers of the Washington Post." Hayes chuckled darkly. "A dead man's switch. How dreadfully cliché. Kill the ranger and the mutt. Take her alive. Break her legs if you have to." The mercenaries raised their weapons. But Madeline hadn't been standing there, just talking. During the brief, tense exchange, she had been silently calculating trajectories, measuring shadows, and utilizing the only weapon she had left: misdirection. She didn't reach for a gun. She reached into her pocket and hurled a handful of loose, stolen surgical scalpels directly at the overhead electrical transformer box bolted to the concrete pillar directly above Hayes' head. Sparks rained down in a blinding, terrifying cascade of white-hot electrical fire. The entire garage plunged instantly into pitch blackness. "Coda! Fast!" Jason roared at the top of his lungs, issuing the lethal German command to attack. The Malinois became a furry, unstoppable missile. In the utter darkness, the K9 struck with terrifying, calculated precision, taking down the nearest mercenary with a brutal, bone-crushing bite to the right forearm. The man screamed in sheer agony, his submachine gun clattering uselessly to the floor. Madeline moved like a literal phantom in the dark. She scooped up the fallen MP5, seamlessly rolling into a stabilized kneeling position. She fired 3 perfectly controlled bursts, taking out the kneecaps of 2 other advancing operatives. She didn't shoot to kill, she shot to cripple, leaving them writhing and screaming on the cold cement floor. Hayes panicked completely, firing wildly and blindly into the dark with his sidearm. A stray bullet violently grazed Madeline's shoulder, tearing through her scrub top and drawing warm blood, but she didn't even flinch. She closed the distance in 3 explosive strides, grabbed the hot barrel of his pistol, twisted it violently upward, and drove her knee squarely into his sternum with rib-cracking, devastating force. Hayes collapsed instantly, gasping desperately for air like a dying fish. Madeline stood triumphantly over him, the hot suppressor of the MP5 pressed directly against his sweating forehead. "You're done, Hayes," she whispered, her voice like grinding stone. "The bonds are completely gone. They were donated to an international refugee coalition 3 years ago. I kept the encrypted drive purely as a bluff, and you just fell for it." Police sirens began to wail fiercely in the distance. The local authorities were finally responding to the hospital's automated lockdown. Madeline looked back at Jason. The wounded ranger was leaning heavily against a concrete pillar, Coda sitting faithfully and alertly by his side. Jason gave her a single, slow, deeply respectful nod. "They won't ever stop looking for you," Jason said loudly over the rapidly approaching sirens. "Let them look," Madeline replied smoothly. She reached into her torn pocket, pulled out the heavy black ghost coin, and tossed it casually onto Hayes' heaving chest. "Tell the directorate that Madeline Hayes actually died in Caracas. The woman who left this coin is someone much, much worse." She turned swiftly and sprinted toward the far exit ramp, disappearing seamlessly into the torrential, freezing Portland rain. She left behind the quiet life of the unassuming nurse, the pale blue scrubs, and the suffocating safety of hiding. She was a ghost once more, but she was no longer running in fear. She was finally free. Jason watched her vanish into the dark shadows, a faint, knowing smile touching his lips. He reached down and affectionately ruffled Coda's ears. "Good boy, Coda. Good boy." If you were captivated by this incredible tale of survival, hidden identities, and the undeniable bond between a military veteran and his loyal K9, please hit that like button. Share this thrilling story with your friends and family who love intense, real-life action and suspense. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more jaw-dropping, gripping stories that uncover the extraordinary secrets hidden in everyday life. Drop a comment below. Would you have kept her secret? See you next time.
Hi, my name is Tran Tan, the owner and manager of Noble Tales. After watching the video, she worked as a quiet nurse for 5 years until a military dog uncovered her secret past. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? For me, this story was a reminder that everyone carries experiences we can't always see. Sometimes the quietest people have walked the hardest roads, and a little understanding can go a long way. It's a gentle lesson about looking beyond first impressions and treating others with respect. Have you ever discovered something unexpected about someone you thought you knew? Which moment in this story stayed with you the longest? If it meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy stories like this, feel free to like the video or subscribe for more.